Thanks for joining us today. While we're waiting for more people to come in, please share in the chat in one word. How would you describe your day today? My word is curiosity. I'm glad to welcome Allison to Product Time Bellevue community, and I'm really curious to discover ways to enhance my strategic thinking today. And Allison, as we wait for others to join, I have a quick question for you. What is the best career advice you've received?
Oh, okay. We're starting with the big questions here. So, what I would say is, so I had an excellent mentor who, when I was switching jobs, he asked me, when I was thinking about switching jobs, he asked me, "Is this company growing, or is it shrinking, or maybe just staying at the same size?" And I asked him why did he ask that question? And his response was, well, in a company that's growing, um, ambitious people can grow with the company, right? There's always more to do than there are people when an industry or company is growing. And so if you're ambitious, that's where you want to be, because you're never going to be in other people's way to grow, because everyone needs to grow. It's a necessity of the business. But if a company is shrinking or not growing, the only way to be ambitious is to take land from other people, right?
Hmm.
This is where turf wars happen. And that becomes inherently a toxic kind of atmosphere. So that implicitly in that question and the advice here is to direct your career in places that are growing, because
Hmm.
it's always easier to nurture an ambitious career in a growth environment as opposed to a shrinking one. So I know right now is not, it's a rough time, right? Because not
Hmm.
everything is growing. But I think that has always stuck with me as I nurture my career, to always be places that are inherently growing, because it pulls you along the wave. And so I'm always looking out for opportunities where there are growth, because it's hard to create that kind of environment when it doesn't exist inherently in the company you're in. So I
Hmm.
think just being really smart about where you go and how you, it's not just how you position yourself, it's you got to be somewhere that's growing too. So I think like just thinking bigger than what you can do and more about what kind of environments you can put yourself in has been always been the best advice I got. That was like years and years ago, but it's really stuck with me.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I agree. Selecting the right company or environment to work in definitely critical for our career development in the long term. All right, so everyone, I'm Stephen Wang, the organizer of Product Tank Bellevue. Today, we're excited to welcome Alison Go to our webinar. Alison has an impressive track record in product management and strategy, working with big names like Amazon and Facebook, as well as in leading roles in innovative startups and nonprofits. Currently, Alison teaches leadership as an adjunct professor at Columbia University. Today, we're going to dive into the heart of strategic thinking in product management. We will explore balancing perfectionism with control, tapping into management psychology, and leading with both confidence and credibility. And if you want to learn more about strategy and leadership, I encourage you to connect with Alison on LinkedIn and explore her leadership course available on Gigantic. I will share the links in the comment section for your information. Without further ado, let's dive into deconstructing vision and strategy. Alison, over to you.
Thank you so much. So this course is the larger course, which is about leadership generally, and this content around vision and strategy. I wanted to give a little bit of background on it. Where did it come from, and why did I create it at all? Much of the insight in here is how I received so much of the feedback in my earlier career, in my mid career, about being strategic, and then there was a lot of feedback about communication and persuasion. Just like everything that's covered in my leadership course was feedback I personally received, and I did not feel like I got the right tools to act upon that feedback. I got the feedback, but then I was like, what do I do with it? And I was just kind of like angry about it for a while. And so when I became a manager myself and a leader myself, whether it's at the executive level, or just like with a kind of mid-level management in some of these larger companies, I I was seeing the same patterns in my direct reports that I had personally, and I wanted to be able to give them better feedback than just be more strategic, right? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what that meant and how to make feedback like that actually useful for people. And so that turned into large portions of this course, right? So let me just, okay. So I think if you're here, it's possible you've gotten a version of this feedback, be more strategic. Maybe as like, when you're asking about how can I move up to the next level in my career, how do I get that promotion? And I feel like some version of this often comes up, but it's completely useless, right? Like you go Google, like, what is strategy? And you get like 10,000 abstract answers that don't really make any sense and don't help you in your career, especially if you're like in a larger company and trying to figure out what it means to be more strategic at a mid-level. So what I wanted to do is like really break down what I think most people think strategy means and what it actually means when I think about it as a manager, and why I think some people can handle promotion versus some do not. This content is not product management specific, but and a lot of the content isn't like PM specific either. But I think the point is a lot of this is universal, and is hopefully tools that like people in all sorts of different roles can use to kind of calibrate what strategic means for them, their level, and what their role in the company is. But okay, so the word strategy, I think the biggest misconception about strategy is that if you are making all the right decisions about what to do and you are executing flawlessly and well, that you are being strategic. It is the aggregation of a bunch of correct decisions. So this is, I think, was my personal understanding of what strategy meant. And so when I would be more strategic feedback, I'd be like, but everything I'm telling us to do, everything I'm recommending, and everything that I have in my roadmap, or in all my docs, it's all like deeply thought out, researched, and correct, hence strategic. Okay. The problem is that's actually not what being strategic is. Being correct is extremely important part of being strategic, but being correct is not actually strategy, right? So when you actually, what I realized that what executives and senior leadership are looking for when they're asking for more strategy is not a series of correct answers. What it is the ability to get people excited about the problem. It's being able to identify the problem, right? And with that, connecting it to the bigger picture, because wherever you are in a company, you are one piece of the puzzle. And so you're in product management, you're building software, you're making all the decisions to make the product great, bring in revenue, make customers happy. But to what end, right? At the end of the day, it's to drive some sort of business outcome, probably revenue or sales or some sort of growth. And so it's also the ability to connect all that correctness, right, with a bigger picture. And then the next part is getting people excited about the solution. So get them excited about identifying the problem and making it exciting to be working on. And then the second part here is, and then having a solution that is worth rallying behind, right? And so once again, being correct about all the decisions is also a prerequisite for strategy, but building excitement and energy around it is as much strategy as being correct. So I think this is what I want to talk about in this presentation, and what I'm pushing and like really want people to start getting more comfortable with, because to do some of this really pushes some of us beyond our comfort zone, because it is much less concrete than what we're used to, but it is like that ability to kind of go into the void a bit is the place where people start getting excited, right? And you can create this excitement around what you're doing and the decisions you're making. So I personally, I think there is a kind of inherent format to all great strategy, whether it's at the company level or if it's at the functional team level, right? And what's interesting is much of strategy and vision is like, it's like 75% not ever done by people who are often very correct, right? So the plan, the very correct plan on the right here, is only a tiny portion of strategy at the end of the day. And that, once I learned that and figured that out, I was like, oh, this is why it was so hard for me to get people to be excited about what I was doing, right? Because I wasn't spending any time on the stuff on the left. So the high level framework for vision and context here is, one, being able to define and speak out loud about a problem and a bold vision, right? So like, why are we trying to solve this problem at all? And why does it matter? So if you're founding a company, this is like the mission statement, the vision statement. This is the stuff that really gets people excited about what you're doing. The second part here is the ability to, this is the really fun part, is to pinpoint why you're having that problem, why that problem exists. And I'm calling it the hidden obstacle, because I think that there'll be examples of it in a second, so it'll make sense with the examples. But often, something big has happened in the world that has created a problem. A hidden obstacle is like this, like, very human reason why it's just not getting fixed on its own. Why is inertia not taking care of this? And then based on that obstacle, that's kind of an amazing insight of yours, the strategic insight, you are then able to create an opinionated strategy that specifically solves that hidden obstacle. So this is where the real fun is. And if you can nail this step, magical things start to happen with your ability to communicate and persuade and get people excited. The next part is for all the skeptics in your audience. So yes, so maybe you're able to make a really awesome point about an obstacle and a strategy, and everyone's like, wow, that's so dynamic of you to have that idea. But here's where you then back it up with data and testimonials. So it's a very important step. Sometimes I think very strategic people skip this step, and then they lose people because they kind of start sounding crazy, right? And then the last part, and only the last part, is when you start to outline the plan for things and how you actually get there. And what I have found with like very high performing people who are at that like senior manager, maybe director level, is their entire career was based on coming up with really smart plans that were absolutely correct and everyone got on board with. But then to get scaled to that next level, the perfect plan doesn't get you there, right? And now you have to be able to do these other three things right before it to really move up the ladder in terms of your influence and your ability, your perception of like the perception of you having vision and strategy. So we're going to dive deep into each of these in this session. Okay, so part one, define the problem and outline the bold vision. Okay, so what do I mean by a problem and what do I mean by a vision? And this will be slightly different from an obstacle and a strategy. So we'll get to that in a second. So like in this stylized image here, I'm saying the problem we're in is that we currently are in the desert. It's pretty miserable. There's no fun stuff in the desert. We're just hanging out and they're just like cactuses and a lot of sun and we're like very uncomfortable. The vision is we want to get to the beach, right? So very lovely, great weather, nice breeze. We got a coconut. We can take a dip and have all the fun we want in the world. So that's the problem, is that we're in no man's land and miserable. The vision is we've got something really awesome going on the beach, and that's where we want to get to. So this is usually fairly straightforward. Like the higher level, like what we're trying to do is pretty easy to articulate. So problems, really well articulated problems, should often feel very painful. So your audience here, if you've written down the problem well, or if you've described the problem well, they're like, oh, that is not good. We need to change that immediately, right? So you're putting it into words in a way that make people uncomfortable that that's a problem that they have control over, right? Especially in a work context. And then you're able to say, and it is worthwhile to be in a different position, right? Turn the tables around in the world or in our company. Ideally, your vision has a narrative component, so there's like a you can literally visualize it. That's why it's called a vision. But it's also good if it's measurable, especially in a business context like that there's like a big new fancy number that you're striving toward. So here's a couple examples, right? So I used to work at a company called Civic News Company. It's a nonprofit around journalism, right? And what we were doing is trying to replace the local news in certain communities that was lost because of the internet. And so this is pretty easy to talk about, right? The problem statement is that certain communities don't even have civic news anymore because the internet made it completely unprofitable to have local news. Okay, and so we think that's a problem because it's a threat to democracy. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that the lack of local news causes less engagement with community and people vote less, and it's just a problem, right? What we would love to see as part of our vision is that democracy and trust in institutions is dramatically restored because we brought back some semblance of local news to as many communities as possible. So that's like the big vision. Let's turn the ship around in terms of local news. And to do that, we want to expand dramatically. So 11 new locations is basically more than doubling what we were at the time. And also launching new verticals. So at the time, we were very focused on education, public education, and we would love to also focus on voting and public health, right? And to do it in a pretty tight time frame. So there's a narrative version, like turn the tide on local news, and then there's a numerical version. It's like launch X number of news sites. So you try to imagine. I don't know, what companies you guys work at, but you can imagine a similar kind of like, turnaround and problem statement and vision and what hopefully that might look like, both numerically and from a storytelling point of view. Now, what I want to impress on you guys is that this is a technique that can work at like a team level as well as the company level. So that first vision was Civic News Company, like an entire company, a startup, like what are we trying to do in the world? But it also works at the smaller scale. And so this is an example, and I could have used you could easily slot in a product example here, but I'm using like an internal HR team who is looking to launch a new interviewing process, right? The way they interview candidates when they're hiring. So the problem here is that this company, this imaginary company, or like it's like real. This is a very real problem in many places. It's a startup, and the way they interview people, it just doesn't work, and they end up hiring a bunch of people that end up not working out, waste everyone's time. It's like takes forever to interview people. And it's a problem if this company is trying to grow, if they do not fix their interviewing process, right? That's the problem statement. The narrative vision is that you've created somehow in the future, you have an interview system that actually supports the growth. And then in this vision, it's en route to an IPO. So the HR team knows that they're hampering the ability for this company to IPO eventually because they don't know how to hire anyone any good, right? And so that's like a real concrete thing in the future that they want. And so this team needs to figure out how to help get there. And numerically, something I kind of was playing with was it's probably something like you want to be able to reduce your attrition rate or the number of bad hires that you end up making. And you want to dramatically increase your positive experience ratings on Glassdoor, right? So I didn't put real numbers here, but this is the kind of numerical thing you could put into a vision statement that would be very clarifying and motivating. So my like thought exercise to you is like in your team or in any given project that you're thinking about that, like how could I have made that more strategic? Like what is the problem statement you could come up with for that project? And what is the vision statement, both numerical and narrative, that you could have come up with as you are pushing that project forward? Now, I think that this step is hard. It's not the hardest of the steps, but it's hard because I think for many of us, there are it's really a mindset problem. Like I don't think it's a skill problem half the time, but what I've noticed in people, like the people who've worked for me and the people I've coached, is that a lot of this is activities that people don't even think to do or are scared to do because they have, a certain set of fears. So I have these mindset goblins that I use in my coaching. And one of them is fear of failure. And the other one here is fear of seeming incompetent. And these are things that just hold you back from saying what you really think, or even stop you from thinking in a way because you're scared that it's the wrong way to approach a problem, or that you'll look stupid going in that direction, right? And so people stay in their lane because of these fears. And actually, bold vision and outlining difficult problems requires you to likely go out of your lane, or definitely go out of a lane that you've self-created. Because I actually think managers often won't tell you need to be, your lanes are actually much wider than you think they are. And so because you believe it to be more narrow, you don't even think to expand your horizons around the tasks given to you or the project given to you right away. So I think some of it is skill-based, but a lot of it is just realizing that it's part of your job to start defining vision and strategy for people, and that it's okay to do so, right? It's actually enhances your work, and makes you smarter and more trustworthy and worthwhile being listened to, because you have thought larger than your little stream. So I think the mindset thing is probably the hardest part here. And I would really challenge people to think through, like, okay, a previous project where maybe I was told I wasn't being strategic enough. I mean, if you were making all the right decisions, you probably were incorporating a lot of this inherently and implicitly in your decision making. But why did you not consider talking about it, right? Why wasn't it part of the presentation? Why wasn't it part of the conversation? And it's usually because you think it's not part of your job. And I would say it probably is, even if no one says it is. And even if it's not, you will be more effective if you embrace this as part of strategic thinking. So here's some just like quick tips, I guess, about how to conquer these goblins. So we've talked about this a little. I just talked about this, but it's just like a mentality about not constraining yourself. I don't know how many silos are there because you just imagine them to be there as opposed to being told that they're there. And the second part is sometimes it's hard to see the bigger picture, the larger problem, because you have a management team or a leadership team that's not great at saying it like over and over again. But if you believe yourself to be more executive, more leader-like than your place, I would say it is also part of your job to go find those questions, right? Go find the answers about, well, what is the most important business problem we're trying to solve? So if you're this HR leader overhauling interviewing, I mean, if you don't know that IPO is around the corner, that this is a blocker to IPO, like, you should be asking, and you should be thinking in this way, like, how am I leading my team to help the company? And so it is upon you to seek out this information just as much it is for you to incorporate it into your thinking and your leadership, right? Okay. Next, this is actually the really fun part, because I think this can be hard, but once you nail it, it's like the clouds open and the sky's clear and the sun comes through and you're like, oh my God, everything makes sense. And everyone starts thinking you're a genius. This is the part where if you can nail this, people really think this is where people start thinking you're like the most strategic person ever, if you can get this down straight. So hopefully that gets you excited. So pinpoint the hidden obstacle and craft an opinionated strategy. So what do I mean by that? So, okay, so back to the stylized thing where we're going from the desert to the beach, and that's our dream. So in this made-up scenario, the obstacle in our way is a giant mountain range. So we're probably somewhere in the west coast of America, apparently, and you're somewhere in the Sierra Nevada and you're trying to get to Southern California. I don't know. So you got a mountain in between you and your vision. And so this mountain is a metaphorical problem, in your business or in your team. And the thing about strategy is that a strategy is a path you can take, one of the ways that you can solve this obstacle, right? So in most problems and obstacles have multiple potential ways to solve the same thing. So in this kind of absurd example, maybe the solution is to mountain bike your way through this mountain, or maybe it's to commission and build some hot air balloon that gets you through, and this telephone booth is a teleportation device. So maybe you're Elon Musk and you've decided to solve teleportation, and that's how you're going to get from one side of the mountain to the other, right? And all of these have their ups and downs. Maybe you're like a fancy theoretical physicist, so the teleportation device is probably the best thing for you, but maybe the bicycle, you're like an ultra marathoner and the bicycle seems like a reasonable choice. So like, there's no wrong answer necessarily with strategy, but it comes from a deep understanding analysis of the obstacle and your that's part of it. And then your ability is to conquer that obstacle, right? So this is where you're interpreting the world in a really creative way. And if you can justify that interpretation and explain it beautifully and colorfully, and also map it to a strategy and a path that solves it in a very specific way, then this is where people will start thinking, oh wow, this person is like exec level smart, we should like keep this person around, right? So let's go to some examples, so I guess some qualities first and then examples. So an obstacle, what's interesting about obstacles, what I found over time doing strategic planning for different companies and also doing it at the product level, is there's usually the obstacle has come around because of something that has changed in history, right? Something has transformed in the world, and it's created an opening. It's created a problem, but it's also created an opportunity. And so there's some sort of paradigm shift that's happening in your midst. And a great strategy usually speaks exactly to that paradigm shift, but can be very controversial. It's almost always controversial to some people. So if it has haters and lovers, it's probably a good strategy, or at least it is a strategy, right? The things that are not strategies are things that like everyone is on, like we should grow 100% revenue. Like no one thinks that's a bad idea, right? I just saw something recently. It was an article, and it was like, a strategy means there's an opposite statement that actually still makes sense, right? So I'll get to that in a second. I'll give an example of an opposite statement that makes sense once I explain with the Civic News Company example. So this is actually actually how we framed our 5-year strategy at Civic News Company. So we identified the non-obvious obstacle is that local news used to be organized by region. So if you're US based in this group here, you probably grew up with like a local newspaper. I'm from Detroit, so I read the Detroit Free Press, and I got all my news from the Detroit Free Press and a little bit from the TV, right? And that was before the internet. And so your newspaper, you got the news, but you also got the comics. I also looked up, TV listings and movie listings. All this stuff was bundled in a regional newspaper. And you also got local news as part of that. Now, though, the internet, there's no concept of a regional newspaper with the internet, right? So I can go look up movie listings on Google. I have Craigslist for classifieds and Facebook Marketplace now. Comics, like you don't read a newspaper for comic strips. You just go to like a web comic now, or you just doom scroll TikTok for comedians. And so many of the things that made sense in a pre-internet world when it came to a newspaper just like exploded because of the internet. So that's what we identified as the non-obvious obstacle, that the world changed with the internet and local news didn't have this nice like wrapper of a regional newspaper anymore. So what we decided our response to that would be is instead of organizing our news company in terms of regions, we organize it in terms of topic. So the sub companies or the children of Civic News Company, one is called Chalkbeat. It's a news site that just focuses on education. Another site is VoteBeat, and it just focuses on voting. And HealthBeat doesn't exist yet, but it will soon, hopefully, and it will focus on public health. And then there are pods within each of those topics that are regional, right? So our opinionated strategy is to take the regional model and flip it on its head and kind of go the opposite. So the opposite of that strategy might be like, well, we're just going to do a pure investigative news play at the super local level, but we're gonna go small and very cost efficient, right? As opposed to go big but flip the regional model. So that's a reasonable strategy. Like you could imagine someone pursuing that, and it's not totally crazy. And I would call that the opposite of what we're doing. So those are two like valid approaches, and Civic News Company has chosen to double down on topic first, as the parent, and the children being regions like Detroit, New York, whatnot. So it's just want you to like kind of think about that and how we turned this historical story about the internet disrupting news and turned it on its head and made it our story about like why we are structured, inherently how we are structured. Okay. So this, once again, works at the team level. And here in this, imaginary company, I'm the HR leader. And what I'm saying is that the reason our interview process is not very good is its own history, right? So it kind of organically emerged, and no one's ever been properly trained on interviewing. And because of this, just a complete miss on standards and training, it's an incredibly inconsistent approach that has then created a lack of trust in the whole system. And then when you don't trust the system, you insist on being part of the interview process. And this is where you interview with companies and it's like you're interviewing with 7 people for some reason. It's because those 7 people don't trust each other to interview properly without them, right? So just this like lack of training and thoughtfulness cascades into just a horrible experience, and you're still not even getting good candidates, right? So if you're the head of HR, the person in charge of the interviewing process, you're going to say that's the problem, that we never invested in this training, we never invested in structure, and then we like have no trust. There's no trust in the system. So the opinionated strategy here is let's be really strict about the number of people interviewing. It's only 4 per candidate, but those people are incredibly well trained. Like we're going to invest in training them like crazy, and then everyone else is just going to have to trust the process. So that's pretty opinionated. Like those people who have to trust the process are not going to like this plan that much at first until they see it works, hopefully, right? So I think this is the same thing. Like it's controversial. Even at the small scale, you can make controversial choices like this, but it's resting on solid ground because it's pointing to the root cause of the problem or the historical root cause of the problem. And so when you can really find the pairing like this of the obstacle and the strategy, it gets people to lean. It's just like a very compelling story, right? Like it's like, oh, that solution makes so much sense now that you explained to me in that way. And once again, I just like you to see how it works at the extremely high level, like the company level, but it also works at the HR team level. So I think it's like once you like kind of figure out how to craft the non-obvious obstacle, and then that opinionated strategy, like you're unleashed when it comes to strategy in general, right? So I think similar, like this is a little bit harder to hone than the bold vision and whatnot. Like sometimes the bold vision is super obvious what you should be doing, and the problem is pretty obvious in how to state it. And this can be harder because you do really have to be interrogating what happened looking backwards in time. But once again, I think all these fears come back into play because it comes back to, it's not my lane to think about, like, how dare I think about the grand scale of history and how it's changing, like what my little team is doing. But in many ways, like the reason you are there and the reason you're solving problems and having business impact is because something changed, like, right? There's an opportunity there for the taking because of this history. So to not acknowledge it just seems silly. So I really think like it comes back to like, that's what the CEO should be talking about. But at the end of the day, maybe not, like you're all part of the same problem. And what executives want, I think often is someone to help to engage with them on those questions and those stories. So fear, I believe, is what's holding people back. And so just like the tactical tips here are like, I think, if you're just riffing with your friends, forget your boss is paying attention to you. Like, how do you explain what you're doing? And like, what's the macro level thing that's happening that explains why you're being asked to do what you're being done, or that explains all the problems that are happening in the world or within your company. And this is, I think, a really good approach because especially once you get to the storytelling part of this, to anchor it in history is always so smart because it feels less personal, right? It's not about, oh, you made this bad decision. It's about like, no, like we're all in this like arc of history, and it's bigger than all of us, right? And this surprisingly works at the micro level too. And then once again, I think fear comes into play when it comes to strategy because people really don't like to give recommendations on things that people won't like. But my contention is if everyone likes your strategy or everyone kind of lukewarm agrees with it, it's almost certainly not, 1, actually a strategy, or 2, a very good one. The only thing you owe people when it comes to strategy is that it's clear and people can decide if they're on board or not, right? Like if everyone agrees, like with me on something, I'm like, something's wrong. I like people when they disagree, because it means I've said something that's interesting. I mean, and you don't, and I'm not saying be an asshole about it. You have to be like really like articulate and convincing, but like you've got to be taking a bold stance, or else it's not really a strategy. So violent agreement or disagreement is the point. So just, that's how you know you're onto something. Okay, so just like quick summary about this. Oh, and sorry, I'm truncating this a little bit because I want to make sure there's time for questions. But because so we're not going to go into how to construct a plan, because I actually think most people here, or if you're listening to this and you're like very growth minded, you likely are very good at creating plans. That's what I discovered about the people who've gotten promotions up to a certain level. They're awesome at making plans, right? That's not the problem. So I don't include it in here in this talk. And then I think the testimonials and the data are very important, but like I think you could intuitively see where you need to introduce a testimonial or a data point that helps make your case. So I think data can be very powerful when you are articulating a problem statement, so like you can show how big the problem is. And a testimonial can be a tactic of saying like, this is why this solution is going to work, right? Other companies have done it. I interviewed, if you're that HR manager trying to do new interview systems, like why the system I'm implementing is exactly what Facebook, Amazon, and Netflix do. And I talked to 3 interviewers there, and it's like it works for them, and this is why it works. That's an example of a testimonial that will really make your plan sing, right? So I leave you with this kind of reminder about what the word being strategic, or the phrase being strategic, really means, and to really disengage yourself from the idea that means being right. It's being right, but also being able to tell the story about being right extremely compellingly. So that's the end. I think this is the last slide. And so now I believe we have like 20 minutes for questions and discussion, and I'm happy to take that on from the group. I know there's at least one comment in there I haven't read it yet because I can't multitask like that, but I'm going to let maybe Stephen moderate some of the questions now, and then happy to answer anything.
Yeah. Everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to post it on YouTube. And Dan has a comment. So he said he strongly agrees that if a job is so easy that it's virtually impossible to fill, the market value for that job is probably super low. And he thinks failure is what makes the work worth it.
Yeah, I think that's true. If you're the bolder the claim, right? It's like risk reward a little bit, right? And so the further you're pushing with your strategy, and the more that you're going out on the limb, and I wouldn't even call it, like, it may not even be on a limb, but you're explaining it in the way that's bigger and bolder than people are used to, the rewards are 10x, right? But like also the downside is, what's the downside? Like if your company doesn't nail their strategy, and if your company is not doing the right things anyway, like your job is only as safe as like the aggregation of all the right decisions about you within your company. So like I still think like it's worth it to kind of overcome the fears that come alongside, not wanting to take bold stances and move outside of your silos. So I agree with the statement, obviously. Very risk seeking, I think, in general, though.
Alison, I have a few quick questions for you.
Sure.
You said strategy is getting people excited about the problem and the solution. I think that emphasizes the often overlooked human aspect of strategy. So my question is if you can share your tips for effectively engaging stakeholders in the strategy development process.
Yeah. Well, I think, and something I say in the course, there's like a section about persuasion where I talk a lot about what it means to be persuasive at work. And one of the points that I make is that when you are doing anything, when you're doing work in general and you're on a project, it's usually about changing something dramatically, right? Like if we were all, and we're all in technology and kind of want to be in a space that's dynamic and pushing forward. And the thing about that is that you're almost always changing something about the status quo. Like that is the point, right? And even if you're in a more legacy company, like if you're doing anything interesting and important, you're probably shifting the mindset of people. You're shifting the turning the boat slowly. Maybe it's faster because you're in a startup. So it's all about change in and of itself. And to do change, you literally have to change people's minds. Like that is the job. It is persuasion. And so like all of this, the point of strategy is it's one of the ways that you get people's attention and start to change their mind, right? And so that's why the storytelling is important, but the data is important because different people are convinced by different things. And there's an investment in the relationship as well. So like in the persuasion talk I have, which is like part of the equation is becoming trusted by people at your work, the people who are making these decisions, being a known entity, having a good reputation, being liked is actually quite important, and there's just no way around that. And then the story itself being compelling with both the testimonials and the human aspect, because for some people the human part's going to be really important, but then you also want to back it up with data because the data is going to be important for another subset of people. And so the whole package is really about getting in people's brains and convincing them in ways that are comfortable to them. And you're never going to do the most interesting things are always involving tons of stakeholders, right? If you only have to convince one stakeholder, you're probably not on a very high profile project. So the more senior you get, the more you have to be able to do this with a larger group of people.
Great. So there's a question from Amy. If you do a really good job telling a story about the problem and how to solve it, couldn't it be that everyone agrees with you because you have a great strategy and you're good at selling it?
I love this question. I mean, maybe, but like I think I'm pretty good at convincing people, and I have never done anything interesting where some subset of people didn't hate my idea, because I think this is a heuristic. So maybe by other circumstances where it just took the right messenger for the problem. But I think the hardest problems are often ones that, there's some subset of people that it's not in their interest to change. Or they're deeply uncomfortable with doing something new, and they would rather stick to something closer to what they're already doing, or like completely just stay with what they're doing. And so like if you're pushing the boundary of interesting far enough, you will always have detractors. And I wonder, it's like maybe there is like it wasn't embraced and then you convinced everyone because they just like didn't understand the problem. That's possible, but that means your next project has got to be something you're pushing the boundary even more, right? And so I would like surmise that if this is constantly true, that you're never getting any pushback with your what you think is like pushing boundaries, you're not pushing hard enough. But I can see it in the first couple projects, like, okay, or like we turned change people's minds enough that like, wow, that was a big win under my belt strategically. But I think real change means like you're pushing against the status quo that really makes people uncomfortable. And it may not be a lot of people that disagree with you. There's always some though, if you're doing something, I guess, controversial enough in the first place.
Here's a question from Dan. When I think about driving change that use a violent disagreement, I tend to think I need a high amount of political capital or trust before taking the risk. Where does that fit into strategy?
Let's see. Okay, so yes. And I think that so there's a couple different things you're saying here. So first thing is I actually think you should separate two things. One is, do you have vision and strategy? Like, does it live in your head, and can you articulate it to just like one individual well, right? So for many people, they get stuck. They don't even think about the things that are bigger because they're so constrained in the way that they've worked, or maybe they got like shot down before, like maybe they explicitly told like stay in your lane, right? Like that actually happens too. And so you've trained yourself to not think big and bold and think about obstacles and the history and all the context. So part one is like inside your own brain, being able to do the strategic thinking and visionary thinking. That's part one. And then there's like, how do you effectively, so like some people struggle to do that. And some of this advice is just how to do it in your own brain. the second part is, how do you externalize that and make it convincing, and like get it to actually happen in the company you're in, right? So I think this is different, and this is where political capital or trust becomes important. And like I have to say, like it was interesting. I just had a call with somebody who was like creating. She's trying to create a strategy position in her company, and she wanted to be that person. And the something I was telling her as advice was, when I was the chief strategy officer at Civic News Company, I did not lead very many of our strategic initiatives. Like, actually, many of the things that happened because of my strategy were ultimately led by the founder CEO, because she was the one with the political capital and trust. So just because you are the one outlining the strategy and vision does not necessarily mean you're the best messenger for it either, right? So sometimes it requires the VP to push it forward, but you are the mastermind behind it. And that can be the right thing to do for the company. So I think, yes, political capital and trust are important, but I would actually say, like, you could be so in a product management scenario, you are probably the same person. Like, you have to execute it and have the vision. But sometimes at like certain levels or certain, like this HR one, right? It's possible that the voice of that plan needs to be the CEO, right? But the HR manager, the HR head came up with the plan, put it together, put the story together. But maybe that's not the right person to make it actually, to be the voice of it, to be the face of it. So I think, yes, 100%, especially to actually make it happen. But this is like all the part of strategy is like reading the room, reading, like what Amy was saying, is reading the company culture and making sure there's the right messenger for the story. Because you're right, like some of this really big stuff, like, okay, are we going to IPO? Like, if you're like a middle manager HR person, are you going to be like evangelizing this IPO? Like, probably not. So I would say, like, you want to separate the messenger question from the content of the strategy and the problem and the articulation of the story. So yeah, at the end of the day, like when I was chief strategy officer, a lot of really bold stuff came out of my work. I was probably the messenger for 20% of it in reality. And for me, that some people will find that disempowering. I was like, I loved it. It's like so much less work to not feel like you needed to do all the work yourself, right? So I partnered with the CEO to get those projects out the door. Yeah,
that makes sense. Here's another question for you. Product strategy, I think product strategy should really bridge the product efforts with the overarching business goals and align with the company priorities. But given that product managers usually focus on granular day-to-day tasks, how can they gain insight into broader strategic objectives and adopt an executive mindset?
Yeah. So two things I think in that question. One is, I think it's probably true that a lot of your time is spent on, user stories, refinements, working with engineers, working with designers. But I would never say that the PM job isn't primarily to be bridging the gap between like customer needs, business needs, and the work, right? So if you like timed everything you did, it probably would be like 70% like day-to-day execution and 30% other, including strategy. But like that small portion of time that's spent on strategy is not optional, right? To be an effective PM. So I think disaggregating the amount of time you're spending on things from the importance of it when you are doing it is very important. And you have to make sure that some amount of your time is spent understanding the business goals. If you are in a business that's not good about articulating their own business goals, like your leadership team is maybe weaker on this, it is your job to go chase it down, I would say, which causes more work. But these are choices you have to make about whether this is a good place for product people to work in general. But like, it is part of your job to know it. And some companies make it easier or harder depending on how well run they are for you to know it. But it's like when I have my rubric of what PMs need to be doing and what they need to be good at, there's no version of a job that's, besides the most junior version, that doesn't assume like company what's like the next 2 years, 18 months of the company strategy, as well as like what are the trends in customer needs in your segment. Like it's just like that is a part of the job, even if it's not the majority of the time spent.
Definitely. I think probably one approach is to leverage your one-on-one with your managers, skip level manager, or stakeholders, and ask those strategic questions, understand their priorities and goals.
Yeah, and I think you probably have more access to executives than you think. It kind of depends on the company, but if you have genuinely good questions, like these executives are not going to mind.
Sure.
Right. So I think it's not. You shouldn't be scared to reach out. I mean, you could be working in a very toxic place, but then like everything has gone to hell at this point, if that's true. But if you're working in a functional, non-toxic place, if you reach out to someone like your skip levels or like they're adjacent, like the CFO or someone in finance, and you have amazing questions about like what's actually going on, I don't think they're gonna mind.
We're getting close to the end of the event, so I have one last question for you, Alison. Could you recommend any resources for product professionals looking into enhance their strategic thinking skills?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple good books. One that the first that comes to mind that is very similar to some of the stuff I'm talking about is Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. The author is escaping me right now, but that is a solid book that goes much deeper into some of these concepts. And it uses different words and terminology, but it's like kind of conceptually very similar. And I would say like, not everyone can afford a coach or a mentor or whatnot. Richard Rummel, thank you. That's correct. But like I said, like so much of this is less about skills and more about like your belief that this is part of your job. I really feel like it's so much about belief, and so finding coaches or readings that are more about mindset and confidence is as much of it as like true skill building, right? Because I think that's gonna like where I see people really trip up. Because when I work with my direct reports, I'm asking like, well, what would you do, and why should we do it that way? And I always have great answers. I'm like, why don't you write that in the deck? And they're like, I can write that. I was like, of course you can write that. Like, well, I don't need to write that. So I think like some of it is just like releasing yourself from the constraints that like you've probably created in your own head, or maybe like from like past trauma, that's real. And hopefully you're in like a healthier place where this is like you can apply these tactics. And I think like that's the direction I would go in. And then the other thing that I found very helpful for myself is the Civic News Company was a really amazing job for me because I had a lot of support, and I was allowed to be like this bold, visionary, slightly annoying person, and I was given that free reign to think and communicate in this way. And what helped me though was I went backwards in some of the jobs where I felt less effective and I didn't get as much done as I wanted, or I felt like people weren't listening to me, and I like backwards engineered what I would have said in those circumstances and tried to like I actually wrote strategic docs for projects long past, like 6 years ago, right? And I was like, okay, if I knew what I knew now about strategy, how would I have approached this failed project, this project that I was just angry about that no one listened to me, right? Like many of those under my belt. And I was like, okay, use this framework, and I was like, how would I have explained what I wanted to do then using what I know now? And I think practicing with real world examples can be very helpful, and you can have some perspective on your own about, okay, well, like I never said this historical arc part ever. And what is the historical arc of this like feature I wanted to build, or this like I wanted to do like a total revamp of an app that I was working on, but I could never convince anyone that was a good idea, right? And but I never ever this was like I was relatively junior at this point, so I would never have thought to do this, what I'm explaining to you. And I tried to apply it backwards, and just the practice of doing it, writing a quick outline using this framework, I was like, that's why I failed, right? And so if you just practice it with older projects, I think it can be very useful and eye-opening. So hopefully that is helpful, and can take time, but I think it's worth it because, like I said, if you can really unlock this skill and the confidence, you will be rewarded for it, and especially in the right environments, the ones that are trying to do the right thing.
Thank you, Alison. That is more than skills, also about mindset, as you said. So we should be bold and really take risks and pushing boundaries. And we're going to wrap it up. A special thanks to you, Alison, for really sharing your valuable insights into strategy and leadership. And I will thank all of you joining us today at a Product Tank Bellevue. Stay tuned for our upcoming virtual meetups and in-person happy hours in Seattle. See you next time.